In any given ecosystem, from a dense tropical rainforest to a backyard garden, coexisting species interact, compete, cooperate, and influence one another in ways that shape their environment and their evolutionary trajectories. But how do we define these groupings of species? What determines which species coexist? And how do they carve out their place in the ecosystem? Today, we're tackling the foundations of community ecology. How do we define communities? How do species fit into them? And what are the forces that shape species richness? One of the early challenges in ecology was to decide how to define a group of species. Ultimately, a fairly standard set of terminology emerged. We have ecological guilds, ecological assemblages, and ecological communities. A guild is a group of species that exploits the same type of food in the same type of way, regardless of their taxonomic relationships. For example, you have a nectar-feeding guild, which includes species that exploits floral nectar as a primary resource. Again, regardless of their taxonomy. This guild consists of insects like bees and butterflies. It includes birds like hummingbirds and sunbirds, and even mammals like nectar-feeding bats. Though these species vary widely in their evolutionary history, they share similar feeding strategies and the same food resources. You could have other guilds like pit feeders, sap feeders, and seed eaters. You get the idea. An assemblage is a taxonomically related group of species found in the same location. For example, if we study all the butterfly species in a meadow, we're examining a butterfly assemblage. Whether they interact or not is irrelevant to their inclusion in the assemblage. It's just about their shared classification and their coexistence. Finally, a community is a collection of species that interact within the same area. That's it. No taxonomic requirement and no distinction based on feeding strategy. Their interaction is the key distinction, whether through predation, competition, mutualism, or other ecological interactions, whether direct or indirect. For instance, a forest community consists of plants, fungus, and animals of a wide variety, including herbivores and predators, whether they're mammals, insects, birds, amphibians, reptiles, even decomposers. They're all connected through a network of interactions. These distinctions matter because they relate to how ecologists analyze species interactions. Are we looking at a functionally similar group, a taxonomic subset, or an interacting web of species? If communities are groups of interacting species, then how does each species fit into the system? This is where the concept of the ecological niche comes in. The ecological niche concept arose in the early 1900s, but it really wasn't until the mid-1950s that it was fully formalized by a dapper young fellow, a professor at Yale University, G. Evelyn Hutchinson. He described the niche concept as an n-dimensional hypervolume, a space defined by multiple environmental factors such as temperature, moisture, food availability, and competition, within which a species can persist for as long as the conditions remain favorable. Fair enough, but one thing that was recognized is that, sure, a species has a set of conditions that it could survive in, but a species doesn't often actually inhabit all of the space of their ecological niche. Why? Well, because there's other species, competitors, predators, parasites that are all having an impact. This brings us to a key distinction in ecology: the difference between a species' fundamental niche and a species' realized niche. A fundamental niche is the full range of conditions that a species could occupy in the absence of biotic constraints, like competition and predation. A realized niche is what a species actually occupies, taking those constraints into account. Take Anopheles mosquitoes, the primary vectors of malaria. In theory, these mosquitoes can breed in a wide variety of aquatic environments, from clean pools to polluted ditches and stagnant bodies of water. This fundamental niche represents the full range of conditions where they could survive and reproduce. However, in reality, some species of Anopheles are rarely found in the more polluted water sources. Instead, they're primarily restricted to the cleaner, less polluted bodies of water. This realized niche is shaped by factors like competition from other mosquito species, which may tolerate those polluted conditions much better, as well as predation pressures from aquatic predators like fish and dragonfly larvae. Though Anopheles mosquitoes could potentially occupy a broader range of habitats, ecological interactions constrain them to a much smaller proportion of their fundamental niche in natural environments. There are all kinds of examples like this. In forests, different warbler species feed on insects in different parts of the same tree. This isn't because they can't feed elsewhere, but it's because competition has forced them to partition the habitat, creating distinct, realized niches. Understanding fundamental versus realized niches helps to explain species distributions, but it also raises another question. If niches are somewhat flexible, then realized niches could expand or contract depending on the presence of other species. Given this, what then actually determines how many species can coexist in a given community? How many niches ultimately form? To answer this, let's look at 3 different hypotheses. First, we have the resource-heterogeneity hypothesis. This hypothesis proposes that the more diverse an environment is, the more species it can support. Greater complexity means more available niches. For example, tropical rainforests have an incredible diversity of plant species, which in turn supports a high diversity of herbivores, pollinators, and predators. In contrast, monoculture plantations, which contain only a single plant species and minimum structural complexity, offers fewer ecological niches, leading to lower overall species richness. In essence, the resource heterogeneity hypothesis is based on the notion that environmental complexity fosters biodiversity by providing a wider range of niches, enabling species to coexist while reducing direct competition. The resource concentration hypothesis, on the other hand, examines the opposite scenario. What happens when a community is dominated by a single resource? This hypothesis argues that some species may thrive in these conditions because they can efficiently exploit whatever the dominant resource is, but others decline due to habitat simplification and reduced niche availability. While these first 2 hypotheses focus on different aspects of resource availability, the enemy impact hypothesis highlights how biological interactions, particularly predation and parasitism, can regulate niche occupation and species coexistence. This hypothesis suggests that predators and parasites play a key role by preventing any one species from dominating. Insect populations are often regulated by natural enemies, particularly parasitoids. For example, studies on tropical leaf mining insects have shown that parasitoid attacks can increase leaf miner mortality by up to 32%, with other species experiencing even higher rates of parasitism. Without these natural enemies, herbivores like these leaf miners could outcompete others in the same guild, reducing overall community diversity. By limiting the population sizes of dominant species, parasitoids can effectively force them into smaller, realized niches, creating space for more species to persist in the community. Each of these hypotheses highlights a different force shaping communities: resource diversity, resource dominance, and the influence of natural enemies. Together, they explain how niches regulate species richness and why some habitats support more species than others. Species don't just coexist. They shape and are shaped by the ecosystems and communities around them. But these ecosystems and communities aren't static. They form, they shift, they evolve over time. In the next video, we'll explore the role that things like colonization, succession, and evolutionary change play in shaping ecological communities. But until then, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.